Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the stages I go through in my either illustration or paintings, because I kind of want to talk a little bit about that process. I was recently watching a video from one of my favorite artists. His name is Alpa. He's got a great big YouTube channel here, and when I heard him talk about this process, I thought, wow, this is so different than what I do. I thought it'd be kind of a cool opportunity to share where I start and kind of the steps that I go through from beginning to end. And meanwhile, we can watch this piece of artwork take place in the background. Now, true of all pieces, no matter if it's on canvas or if it's on paper, I'm going to start with a sketch and line work. And I'll of course, I like to work from scratch, so I might have a reference for the details, right? It might not be the exact angle, it might not be the exact thing that I'm going to do, but I want to make sure that I've got the details right in the sketch. And the one thing that I think Alpa and I definitely agree on is that the sketch is kind of the roadmap for where you're going to place certain things. It doesn't have to be the end-all be-all. Granted, obviously, realism doesn't necessarily have lines in it, but there's also a difference between, say, portraits and mechanical drawings, which half of the time automotive artwork is largely a mechanical drawing. There are hard lines and edges and details that might happen more in mechanical illustrations or renderings versus a portrait, but that doesn't make one better, worse, just different. So actually, I think the line work might even be more significant on a technical illustration or rendering or a painting even that's got cars in it, because cars do have these sharp edges that have to be more defined. Now, not all of them are going to be sharp, of course, but this circles back to why the line work is really important. It doesn't necessarily have to be where you're going to place all your lighting. I'll get into that a little bit later. It's not so much about that, so much as this is the envelope, this is the shape, this is the car, these are the body lines, these are the edges, this is the wheel. Those things being determined in the drawing saves you all the time of trying to figure out where to place that in paint. The drawing, even if I have to go through a couple of stages of it, is kind of me learning to get familiar with whatever it is I'm going to be working on. So whether I do a good first drawing or a bad first drawing, it doesn't totally matter. It just changes how long that process takes. But the reality is, the more time that I spend drawing, I'm looking at my reference to understand where the details and the proportions and the shapes are. The more time I spend on that, even though I don't want to spend an eternity on it, I want to do a good job, but the more time I spend just being in the drawing stage and being focused on what this thing is that I'm drawing, the more I understand it, so that when I do get to illustrating, painting, rendering, whichever you want to call it, I already have spent so much time understanding and memorizing the lines. And if I go straight from line work into the painting, then I have even more of like that fresh frame of reference of this is exactly where I remember all these things belong, because I just drew it or I just spent a bunch of time drawing it. So now I know where to place all these things, which is great. So for me, it's a really, not only is it a fun stage, but it helps me memorize a little bit of what I'm going to be working on. So the next stage that I'm working on is what I just call the block-ins. And it doesn't matter if I'm doing this with acrylic paint, oil paint, or in this case, markers, because I'm working on illustration on illustration board here. The block-in stage is still essentially the same to me, no matter what I'm doing. And it's very much exactly what it sounds like. I'm taking the largest tools that I have, in this case a marker, and I'm blocking in the colors in the solid areas that I think really need the most filling. So if I'm doing an acrylic painting, I might have to make a few passes over area to get the opacity that I'm looking for. In the case with marker, just making clean, solid passes so I can fill those areas. And the reason I want to block all this stuff in early is because all the stages afterwards are sort of based on this. Now, true also that I'm not being super careful. It might seem really precise, and some of that comes just from practice. I know that I'm going to place these lines here, I'm going to fill these areas here, and I'm going to create solid color blocks. But you can see that I go just outside of some of the lines, I go into the fender wells, I go just outside of the body lines, and I try not to get really hung up on this stage. I want the earlier stages to be where if I'm going to go outside the lines, if I'm going to make a little bit of a mess, I want that to happen earlier on as opposed to later on. Because if I do it early, I can fix these edges. I can make corrections later with paint or colored pencil or something. But if I make these mistakes later, then it does get harder to fix. And I do like the earlier stages to be a little bit more loose, a little bit more quick, and a little bit more fluid. When I was watching Alpe's video, what he described was his initial stages were actually the details, you know, getting the eyes right or the lips right. And I thought that was so fascinating because it is the exact opposite of how I work. I'm not trying to get the details in first. Now, he explains in his video that the reason he does the details first, and I've seen other artists do this as well, is because he wants to know that if he can kind of do the hard work first, right? Which makes a whole lot of sense. You know, kind of do the hard parts first, and then everything else can kind of smooth out from there. You're just kind of working on the open, clean areas and making some color decisions, and that makes a lot of sense. Except from my point of view, I actually think of it as the opposite. I think I want to do these big color areas first and save the details for later, because actually I think the details are the more fun part anyway, so I want to do those last. But if I can't get all these broad strokes right, if I can't do the base color, shading, tone right, then doing the details first to me is a total waste, because now I spent time making a perfect wheel. Let's say I start with a wheel first, and I get that wheel perfect. And now I'm starting to do some of the block-ins and the airbrush around that. To me, it would be so out of place just for the technique that I'm used to, because now I'd have to work around that wheel and be so careful. If I'm working with oil paints or something that's a little bit more controlled, in that way, that might make a little bit more sense, but it still feels a little bit counter to me, or at least the way that I'm used to working, because I want to do these big areas first and then transition into doing some of the details versus starting with the details and then carefully working around them. When I'm working, I couldn't even imagine the idea of starting with the details first. I might try it sometime just to see what would happen, but I have a feeling like for me it would be really, really, really slow, because I'm used to painting the details in at the end, and all these block-in and transition stages actually go really, really, really fast. And then the details is kind of where I slow down, which is probably true for other artists as well that are starting with the details. That part is kind of a little bit slower to begin with, and then you kind of work around that. But I couldn't imagine starting with the details. I'll have to try that sometimes and just kind of see where it goes. So after I've done block-ins, what I'm doing next is what I call smooth transition areas or blending. Now, if I was doing, say, an oil painting, I would just, I'd be blending the oil paints, right? Kind of the smooth, soft transitions that kind of take you from the hard shapes to the soft shapes to the soft edges. Now, I can imagine if someone was seeing me doing some marker and would say, well, why wouldn't you just do all your blending with marker? And you totally can. There's no right or wrong way. To me, this is a very slow way to do it. It looks cool when you do everything with marker, but I actually think it's much slower and requires a lot more patience. And if you ever followed anything that I do on social media, going quick is like part of the methodology of what I like. I want to be able to move through stuff as quickly as possible, not only because a quick process lends itself to a certain style, it also helps you think about your process a little bit differently. Mistakes are inevitable, but this is also why I want to do the details at the end. Whatever things that I'm trying to correct, I want to correct at the end. I don't want to be trying to be so careful at the end to create stuff that's just not there yet, if that makes any sense at all. So for the smooth transitions, my go-to has almost always been airbrush, and this is true whether I'm working on a painting on canvas or if I'm working on an illustration board. I'm going to use the paints or the marker to block in these large areas, get the opacity, get these hard edges done, and then I'm going to break out an airbrush. I'm going to mix colors to match what it is I'm working on and use the airbrush to do all the smooth transition work. So in this case, it'll be the red, the black, the gray, anything where I needed to take a solid area and blend it upwards. And cars are a glossy generally, so this actually gives you a lot of space to do hard edges and soft edges, because you need both in order for things to read glossy. My background of working in custom paint shops, doing airbrushing and pinstriping, this method just kind of speaks to me and just feels very one-to-one. I'm doing one step, it's ready for the next, it's ready for the next, it's ready for the next. And it's this airbrush work that really starts to fill out the rest of the area. Now you could also see in this stage, it's just like any other painting that I work on. I'm not doing any masking, I'm not using any freehand shielding. I'm really just letting the airbrush do what it does. And just from a bit of experience, I know that I just need to be careful, place the paint where I want it to go, be careful with overspray. If you're spraying too far away from your surface, obviously you can just end up with a huge cloud and overspray everywhere. So of course you want to be intentional, direct, slow down, be careful, be precise, so that you don't have to do masking. Now you could mask every single one of these stages and get just crazy amounts of precision, but I did that a lot in the early days, and it is just incredibly slow. And again, the name of the game for me a little bit is speed. I want to do the best job possible, but if I spend days on something, I just don't feel great about, what that process feels like. It doesn't mean I want to rush through everything, but like I've mentioned in some other videos before, there's an aspect of working quickly that generates a style of its own. If you're slow and precise on purpose, you'll end up with these super, super sharp, super precise pieces. And I love that as kind of a skillful experimentation of how good you can do something. But in the pursuit of style, I think it's a little flat. I think it's more interesting when we make mistakes, especially as artists, because how we fix them, is part of the process to begin with. And then also, sometimes the way an artist makes mistakes is unique to them. And maybe what I see as a mistake in my artwork might be more of an indication of my style rather than a total error. What I see is going to be different than what other people see, for sure. So just with a whole bunch of time, I've just learned to kind of lean into the way that I make mistakes, which sounds pretty terrible. In reality, I think it's how we individually make mistakes that says a lot about what we do and how we fix those mistakes, or how we decide not to fix those mistakes. Those are also just as important. So once I've kind of got everything smoothed out, I've covered a lot of the area, whether I'm on the canvas or I'm on this illustration board. I've finally taken up a lot of the slack, and I've covered up as much as, say, the white page in this case. If there's a little bit of soft edge around everything, and it's got this slightly out of focus look, that means that when I come in with the details, I can actually sharpen everything up the way that I want or not. So that means I can create a depth of field if I want. So this stage, sometimes I refer to the early parts of it as recovery. So I'm recovering edges, something that maybe just went slightly outside of where the line work where it should go. So this is kind of the fixie stages where I'm gonna figure out where to correct some edges, correct some lines, maybe just tighten things up a little bit if the wheel has gotten slightly out of round, or the airbrush just went slightly far out than I want. The fixes are pretty brief, especially on an illustration or a painting. Like I said, there's errors that I actually want to keep because it's part of the essence of style. Now, if you're just making mistakes, that's not exactly good either. You don't want to just make mistakes and leave them in and pass them off as your style. That's not the same, I don't think. It's kind of difficult to explain what the comfort level is there, but you can read it. You can see it in a piece, whether something feels like it was intentionally done a certain way or left unfinished. Sometimes you can get that read, and you just want it to feel honest and genuine, and you want it to feel like this is how you want your artwork portrayed. So this is the stage where I want to slow down and say, yes, I'm going to spend the last hour or 90 minutes and just work on the details so that I can sharpen up the headlights, sharpen up the edges, bring some highlights into the door edges or that body line that runs down the middle of this guy. So this is really the place where I think is the most fun. And it's oftentimes where I do the most work off a camera, or I have to move the camera to these weird angles because my face is right up there. I've got the tiny little paintbrush with acrylic mixed in really, really thin so I can get these really, really precise lines. And once I've got 10,000 million little details in, you kind of step back and you realize, oh, there's about 10,000 million more that I can do. Or you can pick a stage to stop and just kind of go, you know what, this is good, this is balanced, this works. It can be really easy to get carried away, and you can overwork something, and I see this happen a lot, and I've been there. The problem comes with trying to over-detail something. You're the artist. Don't forget that you're human. It's okay to have some stuff in there that isn't perfect. That's fine, And the stuff that you maybe don't do well on this one, you'll do better on the next one. Just take all your lessons and move them forward with you. Well, thank you guys so much for checking out this video. I hope that it was insightful. I've seen so many different artists do artwork in so many different ways. And I think what it really comes down to is there's no exact one right way to do anything. Just because there's a method that you do that other people don't understand doesn't mean what you're doing is wrong. And just because you see somebody else doing something one way doesn't mean their way is right. Do what makes sense to you. What it comes down to is the end result. How does it look when you're done? Know that at the end of the day, there's really no wrong way. Take your own approach, take somebody else's approach, whatever. Give it a try, see what happens. And of course, have fun.